In the Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, we now come to Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is on the philosophical test of the revelations of religious experience. Now, you have to go back to the last page of the first chapter to put that in context and know what he's talking about. Iqbal says, happily we are in possession of tests which do not differ from those applicable to other forms of knowledge, tests for religious knowledge. Okay, so, let's rewind even further. Knowledge comes from experience plus interpretation, says Iqbal. There's experience of the physical world through the five senses, taste, sight, smell, hearing, touch. There's, that is to say, physical experience. And then there's religious experience, including mysticism and prophecy, but although those are not exactly the same thing. And in both cases, knowledge comes by experience plus interpretation. So you have your experience, you interpret that experience with some theory that explains it, or maybe you should say some hypothesis. And that hypothesis is supposed to be further tested. That's how knowledge works. That is Iqbal's empiricism, a religious empiricism as well as a scientific empiricism. And the whole point of this book is to reintegrate the two. Okay, so how do you test a religious theory that comes from experience? We are happily in possession of tests that will do the job. One is the pragmatic test, and that will happen later in Chapter 5. The intellectual test is the first one, and that's what we're covering now in Chapter 2. The philosophical test of the revelations of religious experience, or the intellectual test. By the intellectual test I mean, and I'm still in Chapter 1 here, critical interpretation, etc., with a view to discover whether our interpretation leads us ultimately to a reality of the same character as is revealed by religious experience. In other words, see if our experience of reality gives us a picture of reality that is consistent with the religious hypothesis that comes from our religious experiences. So, at the risk of oversimplifying, I think that largely just means, can you integrate the world as we know it through science with the world as we know it through the religious hypothesis? So, the intro to Chapter 1 tells us mainly how we're not supposed to do it. But it doesn't give us a simple approach. So he's going to talk about the arguments for the existence of God. And he's not going to give us a simple approach of saying the arguments are great. Traditional arguments like the cosmological argument prove God exists. And he's also not going to say the arguments are terrible. They just don't prove that God exists. No, he's going to tell us to come at it from a different angle. Present the arguments, present some criticisms of the arguments, and then rethink these things, slow down, get the right perspective for approaching this, and then maybe we'll actually see something useful in these arguments. Now, to review the arguments before we look at the text of Iqbal, one traditional form of argument for the existence of God is the ontological argument. Now, somewhere on this channel, I'm sure to go over most or all of these, and videos on Anselm or Aquinas, or maybe some generic video in the topics playlist on arguments for the existence of God. One way of arguing for the existence of God is the ontological argument, which goes back to St. Anselm, although he was borrowing from earlier thinkers. Some of his ideas are in Boethius before him. The ontological argument is more or less, let's not give the argument here. Let's just state that the ontological argument is a way of arguing that God exists independently of experience based on the idea of God. If you examine our idea of God, you find that God must exist. Otherwise, the idea of God wouldn't make any sense. Let's leave it at that. That's the ontological argument. Two other kinds of arguments are the cosmological and the teleological. Now, some people will sometimes, as Iqbal will do here, refer to these as the cosmological argument or the teleological argument, but there are actually several different cosmological arguments. There are several different teleological arguments. Generally speaking, teleological argument will look for evidence of God in creation in this way, by looking at evidence of design in creation. We look at the world and we see how it's nicely arranged and nicely ordered. Maybe these days we look at fine-tuning, evidence of fine-tuning in the universe, like life as we know it could not exist without this, that, something else, and physics physics gets terribly difficult for someone like me to follow, but something about the exact strength of gravity and the exact strength of the strong, weak nuclear forces, and the distance of the Earth from the Sun, and a dozen other things. All seem finely tuned for life as we know it, and therefore, etc., etc., and the etc., etc. might be very important, but therefore, etc., etc., God exists, or it's probable that there's some sort of divine designer for the universe. Or we might say things in the universe that were not created by human beings seem to nevertheless have been designed, like the human eye, or the human being as a whole, or some other aspect of design in biology. These are teleological arguments, and there's cosmological arguments, and they generally argue that God must exist as the necessary cause of the universe. So we observe cause and effect in the universe, and etc., etc. There must therefore be a divine cause. Here's one simple version of a cosmological argument. Although these days what they call the Kalam cosmological argument is pretty important. The one I'm about to give you is from Aquinas. The Kalam cosmological argument, well, Google it, get a short version by Google, or ask me in a comment on this video. But let's do a traditional, more Thomistic one, i.e. more like Thomas Aquinas. I exist. I might have not existed. I exist because my parents caused me. They also might not have existed. They exist because their parents caused them. And their parents existed because their parents caused them, and so on. But it can't keep going on to infinity, otherwise nothing would ever be explained. I can only be explained if what caused me is explained. My existence needs an explanation, and the explanation for my existence comes from my parents. But that is a useless explanation unless their existence is also explained. And so ultimately nothing is explained unless there's some original cause of this whole chain of causation, which is itself able to explain everything else without needing any other explanation. So something which is a self-explaining explainer, or an unexplained explainer, a first cause of explanation, not needing any other explanation, but having within itself its own explanation for its own existence and able to cause other things, and that would be God. So, cosmological, teleological, and ontological arguments. These are some ways people argue for the existence of God, and Iqbal is going to talk about them now. Before we look at the text of chapter 2 and just the intro of chapter 2, that's as far as we'll get today, roughly 4 pages. Before we do that, let me really briefly summarize what's going on one more time. There are several ways of arguing for the existence of God, like the cosmological, the teleological, and the ontological arguments, or cosmological arguments, teleological arguments, and various versions of an ontological argument. Iqbal is going to begin chapter 2 by looking at these arguments and critiquing them, but also hinting that they're not completely useless as long as we approach them from a better informed perspective. This he's going to do by way of introducing his chapter on the philosophical or the intellectual test of the revelations of religious experience. So, what we're doing here is we're asking whether the world as we know it is consistent with the world as described by the religious hypothesis. And this is one way of testing our conclusions drawn from religious experience. Okay? Okay, that's where we are. Now, let's get to the text. Iqbal says, scholastic philosophy has put forward 3 arguments for the existence of God. These arguments, known as the cosmological, the teleological, and the ontological, embody a real movement of thought in its quest after the absolute. These arguments are a movement of thought, a real movement of thought towards God. There's something good about these arguments. But regarded as logical proofs, I'm afraid, they are open to serious criticism and further betray a rather superficial interpretation of experience. So the arguments are open to criticism, and they betray a rather superficial interpretation of experience. If we understood experience better, we would be able to make better arguments, or at least we wouldn't make these bad arguments. Now, the arguments, again, may not be simply bad, but let's see, they're at least open to serious criticism. Now, he goes over the serious criticisms, and this is perhaps a question for another time, but there are, well, I don't know, maybe I'll give 2 examples. There are criticisms of cosmological, teleological, and ontological arguments. And there's more than one criticism for the cosmological argument, but let me give you just one. The cosmological argument views the world as a finite effect and passing through a series of dependent sequences related as causes and effects stops at an uncaused first cause of the unthinkability of an infinite regress. It is, however, obvious that a finite effect can only give a finite cause. or at most an infinite series of such causes. In other words, the cosmological argument I just summarized, 2 minutes ago, 3 maybe, was giving us the idea of some sort of an infinite being, a first cause, an uncaused cause, a self-explaining explainer for everything else. And this is, Iqbal says, an idea of an infinite being, an infinite cause. But we're reasoning to that infinite cause from finite causes. And he says a finite cause can only be logical evidence for a finite cause. Now, while that does not mean a cosmological argument in all forms would be terrible, it just means that a cosmological argument can't prove the existence of an infinite God. It can just prove the existence of something outside the universe that might have caused something. So that's a critique of the traditional forms of the cosmological argument. Now, I pause to say, at another time, thinking through this critique plus Aquinas' version of a cosmological argument, I can't promise I'll agree with Iqbal. I might agree with Aquinas. I like Aquinas. I like his cosmological arguments. But all that is for another time. Our priority here is not to analyze arguments of the existence of God. Our priority is to study a great text in the history of philosophy. So, that's one critique of the cosmological argument. Let's do one critique of the ontological argument. The ontological argument argues that God, I guess I am going to summarize the argument now. The ontological argument, classic, a version of the classic ontological argument from Anselm would go like this. I have an idea of God. God is a perfect being. My idea of God is an idea of a perfect being. Non-existence is an imperfection. So if God does not exist, then a perfect being has an imperfection. So therefore, based on my idea of God, I can prove that God exists. Now, it is indeed impossible for a perfect being to have an imperfection. But the weird thing about this argument is, if God doesn't exist, then there's not a perfect being with an imperfection. Rather, there's just no perfect being. So there's no perfect being with an imperfection. There is just not a perfect being at all. So this argument doesn't feel right. It looks like there's something wrong with the argument. And here I'll admit, I think there is something wrong with the argument, at least the classic version from Anselm. So now to Iqbal's remark. All that the argument proves is that the idea of a perfect being includes the idea of his existence. Between the idea of a perfect being in my mind and the objective reality of that being, there's a gulf which cannot be bridged over by a transcendental act of thought. The argument, as stated, is in fact the fallacy of begging the question or arguing in a circle or assuming what is to be proven. For it takes for granted the very point in question, i.e. the transition from the logical to the real. The ontological argument assumes that there must be some such thing as a real God. And in order for that to be the case, the real God must not just be an understanding in my mind, but an actually objectively existing being outside of my mind. But all of that assumes, well, frankly, the objectively existing being. For the idea of God to have any kind of the existence necessary for it to be the case that the argument for would work. Let me start that sentence again. In order for the ontological argument to work, the God I have an idea of must exist. Otherwise, you never get the subconclusion, a perfect being has an imperfection. The argument relies on the subconclusion that a perfect being has an imperfection. I have this idea of God, who's a perfect being, non-existence and imperfection. Therefore, if God does not exist, a perfect being has an imperfection. But you can only make that if-then work if God actually exists, which is the whole point of the argument, so the argument is argument in a circle. Okay, that's Iqbal's criticism of the ontological argument. I think it's actually a very good criticism of the ontological argument. Now, Iqbal says, I hope I made clear to you that the ontological and the teleological arguments, as ordinarily stated, carry us nowhere. And the reason of their failure is that they look upon thought as an agency working on things from without, etc. It is, however, possible to take thought not as a principle which organizes and integrates its material from the outside, but as a potency which is formative in the very being of its material. Thus regarded, thought or idea is not alien to the original nature of things. It is their ultimate ground and constitutes the very essence of their being, etc., etc. The true significance of the ontological and the teleological arguments will appear only if we are able to show that the human situation is not final and that thought and being are ultimately one. This is possible only if we carefully examine and interpret experience following the clue furnished by the Quran, which regards experience within and without as symbolic of a reality described by it, as, quote, the first and the last, the visible and the invisible, end quote. This I propose to do in the present lecture. Now we'll stop there and do more later. That was just the intro, and I have no idea at this point how thorough we're going to be on Chapter 2. But let me see if I can summarize or paraphrase some of this. The ontological and teleological arguments, according to the simple versions we're usually given, don't do any good proving the existence of God. All three of these arguments, ontological, cosmological, teleological, all three of them fail as logical proofs of the existence of God. But the arguments still have some significance. And in order to understand the significance of the argument, we're going to have to rethink how we think about things. And the problem with how we think is we separate thought and being. We separate thought and reality. We think of thought as something that's outside of reality, where we really should think of thought as something that's within reality. Now, this is actually magnificent carrying on of some insight from American pragmatism by people like William James and John Dewey. I don't know that Iqbal ever read Dewey, but he definitely read James. We'll get back to more James later, maybe. If not, I think the last video talked about James. So the American pragmatists reject what we could call the spectator theory of knowledge. According to the spectator theory of knowledge, there's reality and there's thought. Thought knows the world. Reality's over here. The world is over here. Thought knows the world from some position outside the world. Or you could think of it this way. There's the world, and then there's thought. Thought is outside the world, looking down on the world. And in reality, well, in fact, in thought and in fact, thought and fact are not separate. There's the world and there's thought, but the two are interlinked. And if you want to, you could maybe think of it this way. Thought is a part of reality. We are not spectators on the world. I'm thinking more of John Dewey and William James here than of Iqbal directly. The spectator theory of knowledge says we are spectators on the world, looking at the world from outside the world, and we are actually not that. Pragmatism tells us, William James, John Dewey, we are active players in the world. We are over here on the world. We're not up in the stands or the bleachers or what else do you call them? The stadium seating. We are down on the field, on the pitch. We are in the world. We are active and living in the world. And that thought that knows the world is part of the world. You must rediscover that thought and reality are not separate and distinct. Now back to Iqbal. He says if we can rediscover the idea of thought as actually primary to reality in some ways, then we'll be able to understand the true significance of these arguments. And in this, to accomplish this, we're going to have to rediscover how to think about, well, I could say how to think about the world, but we're also thinking about thinking. Rediscover how to think about the world, rediscover how to think about thinking, but in one word, rediscover how to think about experience. In human experience, thought and reality are not separate. And in some way, which he will elaborate on later in this chapter, I expect, thought is fundamental to reality, or at least to reality as we know it. So if we carefully examine and interpret experience, we will be able to understand how thought and reality are interlinked with more privilege given to thought than we realize as something fundamental to some aspect of reality. And if we can do that, then we'll understand the true significance of the insights that these arguments are getting at. These arguments, the existence of God, have insights, but we have to understand how to think about experience first, how to think about reality, and how to think about thought, and how to think about thought and reality as interconnected, with thought having more of a foundational role in the structure of reality than we usually understand. But in one word, how to think about experience. That's what we learn in human experience. That's how experience works. And in order to do all of this, we must follow the clue furnished by the Quran, which regards experience within and without, experience within the soul and outside the soul in the physical world. The Quran regards both kinds of experience as symbolic of God. Spiritual experience within the soul and sensory experience of the world outside the mind, physical world, are both giving us symbols of God. If we can learn to follow through on that insight from the Quran, he says, then we can rediscover how to think about human experience, which will help us to understand how thought and reality are interlinked and how thought is more foundational to reality than we have usually appreciated, which will tell us how properly to interpret these arguments, which ultimately will help us understand that religious hypotheses drawn from religious experience are, or at least some of them are, able to pass that philosophical test. Happily, we are in possession of tests by which you can evaluate a religious hypothesis drawn from religious experience. And happily, religion can pass those tests. More on that next video. Thanks for watching.